So the holidays are closing in and you might be getting a new Steam Deck for Christmas. Or maybe you bought yourself a Steam Deck and you're just kind of new to the world of Valve's handheld. Or maybe you're like me, where you've actually had a Steam Deck for a while, but you also enjoy the mental clarity that comes from periodically doing a full-blown factory reset on your device to take everything back to formula.
Back to formula.
Whatever your situation is, today's video is all about just some of the first stuff to put on your Steam Deck. I'm just going to go over some of the things that I first load on there, whether we're talking about applications or add-ons, and then I'll wrap it up by talking about some of the games that I put on there and how I organize those, and a few tips or recommendations, I guess, surrounding my rationale. But with all that being said, everybody's priorities are going to be a little bit different, and I totally realize that, so if you have any go-to apps or configurations or games that you think should absolutely go on your Steam Deck first thing, I would love to hear about it in the comments below. But for now, let's start off with the basics like system stuff, apps, and add-ons, and then we'll get to some of the funner stuff like some of the games I first load up on a Steam Deck that's been freshly reset. And right out of the gate, the first thing I do after a full-blown factory reset is to make sure that the firmware is up to date. It's not an especially flashy or exciting thing, but it usually is a good idea to make sure that you have the software for your Steam Deck fully up to date, and that would also include the dock as well, which has its own separate firmware update. Once I know all of that is in order, I go ahead and add any peripherals, especially wireless ones, that probably got wiped during the system reset. This would include things like keyboards and mice, headphones, controllers, any other add-on or accessory, especially wireless ones that pair via Bluetooth, to make sure they're ready to go whenever I need them. Once I know the system's up to date and all of the peripherals that I typically use, especially when it comes to AirPods or my controller, although typically I don't use a Bluetooth controller, I use a 2.4 GHz wireless controller, then I go ahead and move on to installing and setting up EmuDeck. Now I've already done a video guide talking about how to set up EmuDeck, which is way out of date and I should probably do an updated one at some point, but suffice it to say, if you're at all a fan of retro games or you want to just turn the Steam Deck into your own personal portal to all of the games from your childhood, EmuDeck is an absolute must-have, and for the most part it is a pretty flawless setup. And when it comes to deciding which games I actually add into EmuDeck, I don't add like thousands and thousands of ROMs or anything like that. Rather, I just add a collection of personal favorites from each different console that I play, typically some stuff for the Game Boy, Super Nintendo, N64, PlayStation, PS2. There are a ton of games that run absolutely incredibly on the Steam Deck via emulation, so I try to make it a point to really just narrow it down to my absolute favorites because I don't want to have to go through thousands and thousands of different games or anything like that. And by and large, most of these are games that I either already own, or they're games that are so hideously expensive on the secondhand market that there is no way I'm ever going to buy those games, and I'm completely comfortable with simply acquiring them because there's no way I'm going to pay $800 for a copy of Rule of Rose. Also, quick side note and shameless plug for another video, I guess. I did do a guide the other day talking about how I finally used the migration tool within EmuDeck to migrate it off of my internal SSD and move it onto the SD card for the Steam Deck, and that whole process went pretty smoothly, so that's definitely something worth considering if you are on the verge of doing a factory reset. After I'm sure the system is reasonably stable and I've got all my emulation stuff set up, the next thing I do is add Decky Loader to my Steam Deck. Now if you're not familiar, Decky Loader essentially allows you to add a variety of plugins to the deck that let you do really cool stuff like change the theme if you want a different visual look for the interface. It lets you quickly add artwork to your games from within the game interface without having to hop into the desktop interface and manually download and add those graphics. And you can also add things like Proton DB badges, which will immediately kind of give you a visual indicator of how well a game that you're trying to run will actually execute on the Steam Deck, and on more than one occasion that has been an absolute godsend because from directly within the Steam Deck interface you can navigate to the Proton DB page for that title and look at any tricks or quirks or anything that other people have found that makes the game run better on the Steam Deck. It's an incredibly valuable resource, and just having that information at the ready directly within the game interface is hugely helpful if you're looking for a smooth experience, especially for games that are, listed as unsupported or unverified by Valve, where you're not really sure if they're going to run well on the Steam Deck, but in a lot of cases people have found that, yeah, titles like that will absolutely run on the Steam Deck, and just makes it easier all around. Beyond that, hopping back into the realm of gaming, I do always add Chiaki to my Steam Deck. Now, I used to have a PlayStation Portal, which I used to connect to my PS5, which, even though I really love the form factor of it, it didn't necessarily perform quite as well as Chiaki did in my testing. So Chiaki is something I always add to the Steam Deck, even though I rarely use it that much, but every now and then if I'm in another room of the house, or I'm in a situation where I want to play the PlayStation, but I don't necessarily want to go to my living room to do it, it's pretty cool to be able to just fire this up, immediately connect to my PS5 Pro, and just go to town on Arc Raiders or whatever game I happen to be playing that week. And again, the performance for Chiaki is pretty solid. The setup can be a little bit finicky for it, admittedly, because you have to do a weird thing to make sure you get your account signed in correctly. But aside from that one hurdle, it is a pretty smooth setup overall, and you can find it easily enough by searching through the store in desktop mode to go ahead and download and install it, and then make sure it gets added to the front-end gaming portion. But beyond just playing your PlayStation games remotely via Chiaki, you could also go ahead and add Xbox Game Pass to it if you want. I used to do this, but I have since canceled my Game Pass subscription. So if you're somebody who is a big Xbox fan and you want the ability to cloud stream to your device, Microsoft actually does have an article explaining explicitly how to do it on the Steam Deck specifically, which I thought was really great. And I would say that process is a little bit more cumbersome than adding Chiaki, since you do have to edit a couple of text files that seem like they can be pretty nuanced and kind of annoying, and at least once or twice I got the path wrong on them and had to redo the entire thing. But yeah, that's something else you might consider adding to your Steam Deck, especially if you're an avid Xbox fan and already a Game Pass subscriber. And since we're already kind of shifting away from just the system stuff to the intermediary gameplay stuff with Chiaki and Game Pass, now let's actually talk about games that I put on the Steam Deck. And the first thing I do is I try to make sure I use the internal storage on my Steam Deck for the games that I know are just basically my forever games. These are games that I can hop into and play at a moment's notice and have a great time no matter what. Things that I personally consider timeless classics, whether that's Binding of Isaac, Tony Hawk, Power Wash Simulator, any games I could just sit down and chill out with that I want immediate access to at the drop of a hat. And my personal approach to installing games on internal storage versus the SD card is, if it's a game that's an unknown quantity, I'm not sure if I'm going to like it or if I'm just testing it out for a video here on the channel, I'll install those games on the SD card. However, if the game's a known quantity, like I mentioned, like a personal favorite or like a forever game, those I try to keep siloed off in internal storage so I'm less tempted to delete them to clear space, and try to rely almost exclusively on the SD card if I want to install new or untested games. Although I guess also it would be safe to say that I will occasionally put backlog games onto the SD card to play them from there, and that would be games that I keep promising myself I will get around to finishing one day and yet haven't, and I think two of the biggest ones right now that I'm still really wanting to finish, I just have not put the time in yet, would be Sleeping Dogs and Enslaved Odyssey to the West. But regardless of where you decide you're going to install your native Steam games, that's something I usually don't start doing until I know all the other stuff is in order first, to make sure I'm going to have the best experience possible. So after I've done all the system stuff and got my updates in order and made sure the plugins were good through Decky Loader, and then added things like Chiaki or Game Pass if I ever do subscribe to that again, along with all the native games that I like to play, that's when I go ahead and start tackling the non-native Steam games, and that's because those can be a little bit more confusing to install sometimes. And one of the biggest ones that comes to mind that I will always make sure is on my Steam Deck would be the Silent Hill 2 PC Enhanced Edition. Because as one of, if not potentially my favorite game of all time, that's just a game I always like to have at the ready, and that version in particular plays absolutely wonderfully, and it's probably the best one you could play outside of the PS2 original. But there's also a lot of like other indie horror gems or other weird obscure titles or games that you can get from good old games that you might want to install directly on your Steam Deck, and that's usually something I save for the very end because, again, those installation processes can be pretty hairy sometimes, and on more than one occasion I've struggled to get those games to work, and that's the kind of headache that I like to save for the very last step of my Steam Deck restoration process. And honestly, that about wraps this one up. When it comes to the Steam Deck, I hate to call myself vanilla as somebody who spends a lot of time with the Steam Deck in any given year, but the truth is I think I do have a pretty straightforward setup, right? I do like the plugins for the ease of use and all of the convenience they provide. I like a handful of go-to games that I can pick up any time of the year and have a wonderful time with them. And then I have a few edge case apps that I add onto it as well, like I already mentioned with Chiaki, or again the Silent Hill 2 PC Enhanced Edition. But it's entirely possible that there are apps, utilities, or other third-party applications that I've completely neglected to mention here, so if you've already gone through this exercise of setting up your Steam Deck fresh out of the box, or doing a factory reset and added something that you think is absolutely indispensable, I would love to hear about it in the comments below. Coming up on the channel, like I've already mentioned, I'm going to be doing some holiday-themed stuff. Specifically, I think I'm going to explore some Christmassy games for the Steam Deck, so make sure you stay tuned for that. And as always, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to watch videos here. It really does mean a lot to me. Take care, and I will see you on the next one. Bye.